Nobody saw it coming. That's the thing that makes this story so remarkable, so genuinely unlike anything the British royal family has faced in the modern era. Not one crisis arriving at the door of Buckingham Palace, not one scandal requiring careful management and controlled communication, not one difficult person or one difficult season requiring patience until the storm passed. What arrived in the space of a few extraordinary months, beginning in late 2023 and accelerating through 2024 and into the years that followed, was something qualitatively different from anything the institution had prepared for. It was a collision of crises, so varied in their nature, so simultaneous in their timing, and so personal in their content that even the most seasoned royal observers ran out of historical comparisons. To understand the scale of what happened, you have to understand what the royal family looked like going into it. By the autumn of 2023, the institution was in better shape than many people had expected after the tumultuous years of Harry and Meghan's departure, the death of the Queen, and the transition to a new reign under Charles. The coronation in May of that year had been a success, a spectacular piece of national theater that drew enormous global audiences and reminded people, at least temporarily, why they found the monarchy compelling. Kate, the Princess of Wales, was arguably the most popular member of the royal family by a considerable margin, a figure of genuine warmth and elegance who had spent more than a decade learning how to occupy her extraordinary position with grace. William was steady, serious, increasingly credible as a future king. The family felt, if not entirely stable, then at least functional, and then everything changed at once. It started quietly enough, as the most destabilizing things often do. On the 17th of January 2024, Kensington Palace announced that Catherine, Princess of Wales, had undergone planned abdominal surgery at the London clinic and would be remaining in hospital for 10 to 14 days before returning home to Windsor to recover. The statement described her condition as non-cancerous. It said the public should not expect to see her until after Easter. It was brief, it was measured, and it was designed to manage the situation with the minimum of disruption. What it actually did was light a fuse. Because in 2024, in the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles and an internet that runs on speculation and conspiracy with the same comfortable ease that a car runs on petrol, a brief statement about a mysterious abdominal surgery affecting one of the most famous women on the planet was never going to be enough. The questions started almost immediately. What was the surgery for? Why was she in hospital for so long? Why weren't there photographs? Why was William pulling out of engagements? Why was the palace saying so little? Each day of silence from Kensington Palace fed the speculation rather than quelling it, and the speculation grew in scope and absurdity with every passing week. By February, the hashtag asking where Kate was had accumulated hundreds of millions of views across social media platforms. By early March, it had crossed 800 million. The internet had decided that something was being hidden, and no amount of quiet reassurance from palace spokespeople was going to persuade it otherwise. Then came the photograph. On the 10th of March, which was Mother's Day in the United Kingdom, Kensington Palace released what they clearly hoped would be a calming, normal, human image. Kate smiling, surrounded by her 3 children. The first official photograph of her the public had seen since December. It was warm and natural, and it was supposed to end the speculation cycle entirely. It achieved the opposite. Within hours, eagle-eyed members of the public and then professional photo analysts began pointing out inconsistencies in the image. Princess Charlotte's sleeve appeared to have been blurred. The alignment of certain elements didn't look right. The Associated Press, one of the most respected news agencies on the planet, issued a kill notice, withdrawing the image from circulation because it didn't meet their standards for photographic integrity. Reuters and Getty followed. The palace was silent, and then Kate herself issued a personal statement apologizing for the confusion and explaining that she occasionally experimented with editing photographs. It was a well-intentioned admission that managed somehow to make everything significantly worse. The conspiracy theories that had been simmering for weeks erupted. Social media platforms hosted endless speculation about everything from secret illness to marriage breakdown to scenarios so lurid they barely deserve repetition. The palace's communications strategy, which had been built on the principle of saying as little as possible and trusting the public to wait patiently, had completely collapsed. They had lost control of the narrative, not to a hostile journalist or a disgruntled former employee, but to the sheer unstoppable momentum of modern internet culture, which simply does not recognize the old protocols around royal privacy. And then, on the 22nd of March 2024, Kate sat down before a camera in the gardens at Windsor and told the world the truth. She had undergone the abdominal surgery in January. The surgery had been successful, but the tests afterward had found something that hadn't been expected. Cancer had been present. She was now in the early stages of preventative chemotherapy. She had needed time to process it herself. She had needed time to explain it to her 3 children, to reassure George and Charlotte and Louis in language that was appropriate for their ages, to make sure they understood that she was going to be okay before she told anyone else. She sat in a striped shirt with no palace backdrop behind her, just the garden, just herself, speaking without notes and without artifice. She said it had come as a huge shock. The world stopped. The 2 months of frenzied speculation dissolved almost instantly, replaced by something much simpler and much more powerful: genuine sympathy. The polling in the days that followed showed Kate's personal approval ratings reaching the highest point of her entire public life. People who had spent weeks posting conspiratorial theories about her whereabouts were suddenly posting messages of love and support. The speculation hadn't been malicious, it had been anxiety. The anxiety of people who had become genuinely attached to a public figure and had been frightened by her absence. And when she finally spoke to them directly, the anxiety gave way to warmth. Kate had done the hardest possible thing with courage and openness, and the public felt it and responded in kind. But here is what made this situation unlike anything the monarchy had faced before. Kate's announcement was not the only medical bombshell the family had been managing. It was the second one. Just 6 weeks earlier, in February 2024, Buckingham Palace had announced that King Charles III had been diagnosed with cancer. He had gone into hospital for a procedure related to an enlarged prostate, and during that procedure, doctors had discovered a separate cancer diagnosis. The palace had moved quickly, transparently, decisively. Charles himself had chosen to make the announcement public, his reasoning being explicitly stated. He wanted to prevent speculation, and he hoped that by speaking openly about his diagnosis, he might help the many millions of people around the world who were dealing with their own cancer journeys. It was a remarkably modern decision for a man who had spent his entire life in an institution built on privacy and discretion. But what it meant, when you put it alongside Kate's diagnosis, was that in the space of 6 weeks, the 2 most senior working members of the royal family, after the king himself, which is to say the king and his daughter-in-law, had both been diagnosed with cancer and were both undergoing treatment simultaneously. The institution, which runs on the energy and presence and visible activity of its most prominent members, was suddenly operating with a significant portion of its capacity offline. William was holding everything together. He was appearing at royal engagements, meeting world leaders, carrying out the duties of the Prince of Wales, while simultaneously being a husband to a wife undergoing chemotherapy, and a son to a father fighting cancer, and a father himself to three young children who were trying to process something enormous in their own small lives. Later, when he was asked about the year, he used a single word. He said it had been brutal. He said 2024 was the hardest year he had ever had. The months that followed were ones of extraordinary tension and gradually of something approaching relief. Kate made her first public appearance after the cancer announcement at Trooping the Color in June, arriving in a carriage with her children and receiving a reception from the crowds that was genuinely emotional. She went to Wimbledon in July and received a standing ovation when she walked into the royal box with Princess Charlotte beside her. In September, she announced she had completed chemotherapy. In January 2025, she confirmed she was in remission. Each of these moments carried a weight that went beyond normal royal appearances, because they were not performances of duty, but evidence of survival, proof that the woman the country had been worrying about was still there, still fighting, still present. Charles's journey was longer and more complex. His treatment continued through 2025, with the palace issuing careful periodic updates that were careful to be encouraging without being falsely triumphant. By December 2025, reports emerged that his treatment schedule was being revised in a way that suggested positive progress. He and Kate appeared together at a state banquet at Windsor that same month, two people who had traveled through extraordinary difficulty and come out the other side, and the image of them together carried a symbolic weight that was hard to articulate but impossible to miss. They had both, in the same terrible year, stared at the same frightening thing and kept going. It created a bond between them that people close to the family described as genuine and deep, a shared understanding that went beyond anything that the normal ceremonies and protocols of royal life could have produced. But even as the medical crises were playing out, the institution was absorbing shocks from another direction entirely. Because while Kate and Charles were navigating their diagnoses, while William was managing his family's private terror with public composure, the rest of the royal family was being dragged through a crisis that had been building for years and that finally, spectacularly, reached its most devastating moment in February of 2026. The Andrew story had been a slow-motion disaster for so long that many people had become almost numb to it. And then, on the 19th of February 2026, Thames Valley Police arrested Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, formerly known as Prince Andrew, Duke of York, on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The charge related to allegations that had emerged from a massive release of files connected to the late Jeffrey Epstein, the American financier and convicted sex offender who had died in a New York jail in 2019 while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. Among the millions of documents released by the United States Department of Justice were emails and communications that appeared to show the former prince sharing confidential trade information with Epstein during the period when he had served as Britain's special envoy for international trade. The arrest was separate from the earlier allegations made by Virginia Giuffre, who had claimed she was trafficked to Britain to be sexually exploited by the prince in 2001. Those allegations had been settled in a civil case in 2022, with Andrew paying a sum that was widely reported to be in the millions and issuing a statement expressing regret to Giuffre and her supporters without admitting liability. But the Epstein files had opened a new front entirely. Andrew was held for nearly 11 hours before being released. The photographs of him leaving the police station, slouched in the back of his car, looking shocked and confused, went around the world within minutes. Newspapers in Britain dedicated page after page to the story. Some commentators reached for comparisons to the abdication crisis of 1936. Others went further back. One radio correspondent noted dryly that the last member of the royal family to be placed under arrest was King Charles I in 1647, and that things had not worked out particularly well for him. The moment carried a weight that was difficult to fully absorb. A man who had been born a prince, who had served in the Falklands War, who had spent decades as a working member of one of the most recognizable families on the planet, had been fingerprinted and questioned by police in a building 100 miles from the palace in which he had grown up. King Charles's response was to do what the institution had learned, painfully and slowly over generations, that it must do in moments of existential crisis. He kept going. On the afternoon of his brother's arrest, the king was in the front row at London Fashion Week. Queen Camilla attended a lunchtime concert. Princess Anne visited a prison. The message was clear and it was deliberate. The institution is not the individual. The individual must face the law. The institution continues. Charles issued a brief statement saying the law must take its course and that it would not be right for him to comment further while the process continued. He had, months earlier, in October 2025, already stripped Andrew of all his remaining titles and honors and evicted him from Royal Lodge, the 30-room house in Windsor Great Park that had been his home for years. He had done everything within his power to separate the institution from the individual before the arrest ever happened, which meant that when the arrest came, the separation was already visible and credible. But none of that made it easy. Charles was managing his own cancer treatment, maintaining a working schedule that his doctors were reportedly constantly negotiating with his diary team, carrying the weight of his brother's catastrophic situation, all while trying to demonstrate to the country and the Commonwealth that the monarchy was stable, purposeful, and worth the considerable faith that was still being placed in it. The pressure on one man in his mid-70s dealing with a serious illness while navigating the worst institutional crisis in decades was almost incomprehensible. And yet the evidence suggested that he was managing it. The public appearances continued. The king's warmth toward ordinary people, something that had always been a less noticed quality beneath his more formal public image, was visible and genuine at every engagement. What made the situation facing the royal family in these years genuinely unprecedented was not any single element of it, but the accumulation. Previous royal crises had been singular. The abdication crisis of 1936 was a constitutional earthquake, but it was a single earthquake with a clear resolution. The death of Diana in 1997 was a trauma of extraordinary depth, but it resolved over weeks into a period of genuine national mourning and eventually into a modified but stable new relationship between the palace and the public. The Annus Horribilis of 1992 was a brutal year of personal and institutional damage, but it played out over time and produced a series of reforms that actually strengthened the institution in the long run. What happened from 2024 onward was different because it was everything at once. The medical crises of the two most visible working royals, the ongoing legal and moral catastrophe surrounding Andrew, the persistent estrangement of Harry and Meghan, and the continued public airing of family grievances that it produced, the questions about the future of the Commonwealth, the questions about whether a monarchy built for a different era could truly speak to younger generations, all of it pressing against the institution simultaneously. And in the middle of all of it, there was William. Watching him navigate this period was watching someone who had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of impossible moment his entire life. Not because anyone had told him it was coming, but because the combination of his temperament and his training and his particular history had produced someone unusually equipped for sustained crisis. He had lost his mother at 15 in the most public and traumatic way imaginable and had kept walking. He had watched his father's decades of public criticism with a composure that was partly the product of discipline and partly of deep loyalty. He had built a marriage and a family that, despite the unimaginable scrutiny, had remained genuinely stable and genuinely loving. And when his wife was diagnosed with cancer, when his father was diagnosed with cancer, when his uncle was arrested, when the pressures came from every direction at once, he held. He was not perfect. He was not untouched. He described the year as brutal, and his face, when he said it carried the evidence of that truth, but he held. The unexpected challenge that this story illuminates is not ultimately about cancer or scandal or arrest or any of the specific events that unfolded. The unexpected challenge is the one that the royal family has faced in some form since the age of mass media arrived and changed everything. The challenge of being human in a role that requires you to be symbolic. The challenge of having genuine, private, devastating experiences while the world watches and interprets and judges every visible response to those experiences. The challenge of maintaining the appearance of an institution when the institution is made of people, and people get sick, and people make catastrophic errors of judgment, and people fall in love with the wrong person, and people fall apart, and the institution has to absorb all of it without visibly cracking. Kate's decision to share her diagnosis in the way she did, in that stripped-back video with no palace backdrop and no prepared statement read from a teleprompter, just herself speaking to the camera in her own words, turned out to be the most significant communications decision the family made in years. It worked, not because it was strategically clever, although it was. It worked because it was honest. She said the words cancer and chemotherapy and shock and fear and young children needing reassurance. And in saying those words, she closed the gap that had been opening between the palace and the public for 2 months. She reminded people that she was a person, not a symbol, and that recognition released the sympathy and the affection that had been damming up behind weeks of speculation and frustration. Charles's decision to announce his diagnosis publicly, to frame it explicitly in terms of helping others who were going through similar experiences, did something similar. It was a departure from the old playbook, which would have managed the diagnosis privately for as long as possible, and it was a departure that worked. The question of whether the institution can sustain this kind of openness in the long run, whether it can maintain the human transparency that these crises forced upon it while still preserving the dignity and continuity that are the monarchy's core reasons for existing, is one that nobody has fully answered yet. The tension between those two things, between being known and being symbolic, between being accessible and being timeless, is perhaps the most unexpected challenge of all. Not a cancer diagnosis, however devastating, not a criminal investigation, however enormous, but the constant, grinding, unresolvable tension between an institution built for permanence and a media environment built for the immediate, the personal, the raw, and the real. What is clear in the middle of all of it is that the royal family survived. Charles continued to reign and to work and to embody something that millions of people in Britain and across the world still found meaningful. Kate returned to public life and was greeted with a warmth so genuine it sometimes seemed to surprise even her. William stood in the gap where a future king needed to stand and filled it with something real. The institution absorbed shocks that would have broken a less resilient structure entirely and emerged, imperfect and tested, but still present, still functioning, still somehow relevant to the lives of the people it existed to serve. That resilience is not an accident. It is the product of generations of people learning, often through failure, that the only way an institution built on the idea of permanence survives is by choosing at every moment of genuine crisis to be more human rather than less, to lower the flag rather than hide behind protocol, to sit in a garden in a striped shirt and say the true and frightening word out loud, to respond to the impossible complexity of human life not with the cold machinery of institutional management, but with something that looks and feels and is indistinguishable from simple courage. The most unexpected challenge the royal family ever faced was perhaps this: discovering that the thing most likely to save them was the very thing they had spent centuries trying to hide, their own humanity.